She entered in green and whispered truths that chilled the room. Welcome to Tea and Clue. I'm your host, Elias Thorne. Let me know where you're watching from. I read every comment. This community means so much to me. Thanks for being part of it. Let's begin the confession. It began, as most peculiar things in St. Beryl's did, with a sound that didn't belong. The village had spent the morning in the scented lull of early summer. Bees sauntered lazily over the rose beds. The greengrocer's son had parked his bicycle lopsided against the post office, and the vicar's wife was giving her yearly lecture on the importance of herbs in the parish hall. And then came the unmistakable sound of broken glass, sharp, dissonant, and startlingly out of place. It came from the back of Weatherly House, a rather stately if somewhat tired old Georgian residence belonging to Colonel Geoffrey Hardcastle and his new wife, the radiant, whisper-inducing, altogether too young Delphine. The house had been let go in recent years. Ivy curled possessively over the south wing, and the hydrangeas sulked in the shade, but the couple had done their best, hosting afternoon teas and badminton matches in a gallant effort to charm themselves into the good graces of St. Beryl's. On this particular afternoon, the drawing room was host to a gathering that was both typical and not. It had been billed as a charity afternoon in aid of the village library, though the true purpose, as Miss Marple well knew, was to parade Delphine's new French wallpaper and the Colonel's recent investment in a mechanical tea urn that hissed like a venomous serpent. Miss Marple sat near the window, a fragile china cup of chamomile perched delicately in her lap, listening more than speaking, as she always did. The conversation in the room moved with the usual eddies of village gossip. Mrs. Weatherby's scandalous new hair color, young Alan Tripp's growing interest in the vicar's daughter, and the state of the Major's hedge. Polite, inconsequential, and, of course, loaded with significance for those who cared to look. Delphine Hardcastle moved through the room with a theatrical sort of elegance, trailing a silken scarf that caught on every bit of furniture it passed. She was in green, a vivid, almost brazen shade that matched neither her complexion nor the soft tones of the house. But it suited her somehow. She kissed cheeks with deliberate coolness, laughed just a second too late, and, when she reached Miss Marple, offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You always observe so quietly, Miss Marple," she said in a voice like satin pulled taut. "One would think you were writing a book in your mind." "I find people endlessly interesting, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently, "especially when they try not to be." The younger woman blinked, her smile flickering, and turned quickly to greet Mrs. Ellison, whose latest brooch was the talk of High Street. Miss Marple sipped her tea and watched, and then the glass shattered. It wasn't dramatic. No scream, no crash of furniture. But it was precise and jarring, like the quick snip of scissors through silk. The conversation fell into silence. Heads turned. A moment passed, and then Colonel Hardcastle, all chest and mustache, strode briskly toward the source of the sound. "Nothing to worry about, I'm sure," he called with forced joviality. "Likely that blasted cat knocking something over." But Delphine had gone quite pale. Her hand, raised to her throat, trembled minutely before she forced it down again. No one else seemed to notice, but Miss Marple did. And she also noted that Delphine was no longer wearing her scarf. Within minutes, the party resumed, though the atmosphere never quite recovered. Delphine did not return to the drawing room, and the Colonel made vague excuses about a sudden headache. Gossip resumed in earnest. Miss Marple stayed only a little while longer, thanking the maid for the tea with customary warmth and pausing on the way out to peer over the side path that led toward the back garden. It was there that she saw the shards of glass. They glinted in the sun beside a toppled flower pot, unnaturally bright against the soft green of the lawn. And just beyond them, half concealed under a hedgerow, lay a long strip of fabric, green silk torn at the edge. Miss Marple did not stoop to retrieve it. She merely stood for a moment, watching the way it fluttered slightly in the wind. like a flag of surrender. Then, with a small, nearly imperceptible nod, she turned and made her way toward the village lane. 2 days later, Delphine Hardcastle was found dead in her dressing room. The windows were locked from the inside. There was no note, and she had been wearing green. The news spread through St. Beryl's with the quiet ferocity of a winter frost. By morning, the villagers spoke of little else. Delphine Hardcastle, so young and dazzling, had been found lifeless by her lady's maid, Ruby Clark, just before 7 o'clock. Her dressing room had been locked from within, the key discovered still in the door. No sign of struggle, no wound, and no message, save for the unsettling calm of the room and the look on her face. Surprised, not terrified, as if death had whispered something unexpected to her in her final breath. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Simpkins refused to hand over a single apple without first delivering her theory. "Sleeping draughts," she declared, placing a Braeburn decisively into a paper bag. "You mark my words. She was never right, not since that business with her sister in Winchester. Very peculiar family. Poison always runs in the blood." At the post office, Mr. Ellison confided to a queue of 5 that the colonel was barely standing, though he himself had not seen the man and was basing this claim solely on the drawn curtains at Weatherly House. Miss Marple, meanwhile, declined to speculate. She sat quietly with her knitting in the garden behind St. Mary Mead's rectory, listening to the bees and waiting for someone to mention something real. It did not take long. "You've heard about poor Delphine, I suppose," said Reverend Halliday's wife, appearing with a teapot balanced on a tray and a look of quiet agitation beneath her Sunday composure. "Yes," said Miss Marple, eyes on her stitches. "Very sad. So young. And yet not unexpected, wouldn't you say?" Mrs. Halliday hesitated. "You noticed her dress at the tea, didn't you?" "The green?" Miss Marple nodded. "Hard to miss. There's something—" The vicar's wife sat, adjusting her skirt. "Delphine came to me last week, quite out of the blue. She asked if the church kept private confession. Roman style, she called it, though I said of course not. And why would she ask such a thing? She looked so frightened, Jane. She said," her voice lowered, "she said she thought she might do something she would regret. That if she wore green to tea, I was to take it as her sign." Miss Marple paused, her needles suspended in the air like tiny antennas. "And what did you say?" "I thought she was being melodramatic. She always was, wasn't she? A flair for the stage. But she meant it. She wore the dress, and now—" Mrs. Halliday trailed off. Miss Marple resumed her knitting slowly. "People don't often speak plainly about guilt, but they do sometimes ask to be noticed. That's often the more important thing." Back at Weatherly House, Detective Inspector Cray had been summoned from Bexminster. A sensible man with a creased brow and a disdain for anything not written in a constable's report. He did not welcome what he privately called village meddling. Still, he knew Miss Marple by reputation. He had encountered her once before during the unfortunate matter of the gardener's will and had left with a grudging respect for her ability to uncover things no magnifying glass could. "Locked room," he muttered, pacing the threshold of the dressing room. Fireplace sealed, windows fastened, door locked from the inside, key in the latch. No evidence of poison. Coroner says her heart just stopped, but these modern ladies, well, nerves, diets, and all that. Colonel Hardcastle, grey and silent, remained in the study, hands clasped like 2 slabs of weathered stone. He had not yet asked how she died. Ruby Clark, the maid, was tearful, but firm. "She was pale all week, sir, not eating. But she kept saying she was on the brink of something. Kept checking the post." "The post?" Cray blinked, expecting a letter. She never said. But she stared at the door each morning like it owed her something. In the village, Miss Marple was making her way to the small shop where Ruby's mother worked the register. Mrs. Clark, a stout woman with the sharp gaze of one who had raised 6 children on 2, little sleep, barely looked up as Miss Marple entered. "I've just come for a bit of lavender oil," Miss Marple said mildly, selecting a small bottle from the shelf. "Terrible thing," Mrs. Clark said, voice clipped. "Poor girl gone just like that." "Ruby must be shaken," Miss Marple offered gently. "She's loyal and smart, knows when to keep quiet." Mrs. Clark paused, though even she couldn't help noticing the mood in that house was turning. That woman knew something. Miss Marple tilted her head. "What sort of something?" Mrs. Clark didn't meet her gaze. "I don't like to say, but Delphine was frightened. She said so herself last Sunday. If something happens," she told Ruby, "don't believe it was natural." Those were her words. At the end of the lane, the local newspaper editor, Mr. Eddington, was setting type for a special edition. "Tragedy at Weatherly," the headline would read, but Miss Marple already knew the true story wouldn't be in the print. It was in the pauses between conversations, in the stiff way Mrs. Ellison didn't mention her bridge partner, in the sudden silence when the Colonel's name came up near the butcher's. There was something collective in it, an agreement to speak carefully, to preserve something unspoken. That evening, Miss Marple walked past Weatherly House just as the sun began to fall, casting the gardens in a warm, peachy glow. The broken flower pot had been removed, but a faint indentation still remained in the grass near the hedge, and the edge of a green thread clung to the bark of the nearby shrub. Not silk this time, cotton. Different shade. She made a small noise of interest and walked on. At home, she poured herself a modest cup of warm milk and sat with her diary. She noted down a few quiet facts. One scarf missing from the drawing room, a change in Delphine's tone the week before her death, a maid mentioning the post, and a woman in green asking the vicar's wife about confession. Most people would conclude Delphine had taken her own life, a tragic act of a woman overwhelmed, but Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that suicides do not usually leave behind such deliberate, performative acts. No shattered glass in the garden, no scarves under hedges, and certainly no coded requests at tea. No, someone had heard her fear and hastened the moment that silenced it, and that someone likely knew she was going to confess, which meant they had been watching. The question, then, was not just how Delphine died, it was who needed her to die before she could speak. And Miss Marple, of course, had already begun to notice who was growing quieter since. The following morning brought a fine drizzle that softened the hedgerows and blurred the edges of Weatherly House. Miss Marple stood at her front window in her pale blue dressing gown, watching the road beyond the lilac bushes. Even in mist, the movement of people, how they stepped, whom they avoided, what they carried, told stories that words might conceal. And this morning, several stories seemed to be avoiding each other entirely. Reverend Halliday passed by without stopping, though he usually tipped his hat. Behind him came Mrs. Ellison and Mrs. Simpkins, walking side by side with matching umbrellas and faces too still to be called casual. They didn't gossip this time. They didn't even glance toward Weatherly House. Miss Marple closed the curtain quietly and moved to the writing desk where she kept the parish newsletter and her old correspondence. She drew out a narrow envelope from the drawer and placed it beside the unopened lavender oil she had purchased the day before. Then she sat and began to write a brief note in tidy, looping script, eyes pausing now and then, not on the page, but on the reflection in the glass of the rain-touched window behind her. At Weatherly, the house had resumed its silence. Colonel Hardcastle had remained mostly out of view, emerging only once to speak stiffly with Inspector Cray, who was conducting interviews in the library. The Colonel's voice had lost the confident bark it once had. It now cracked in places, splintered like old wood. "Nothing was amiss," he said, fingers clenched around a handkerchief. "She was quiet the day before. That wasn't unusual." Cray studied him without blinking. "You didn't notice anything peculiar? Something missing? Anything out of order in the room? No. She often kept the door locked in the mornings. She said it helped her think. Cray shifted slightly. Think about what? The colonel hesitated. She was writing something. I don't know what. She always said she wanted to keep a record of village life. Her own memoirs. She fancied herself very observant. Was she? Cray asked. The colonel did not answer. But his silence said she had been, and dangerously so. Meanwhile, Ruby Clark sat in the small scullery, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. Her face was pale, but her eyes were alert. Miss Marple had arranged, gently and indirectly, to visit under the pretense of returning a misplaced glove. The girl had accepted tea and poured it with shaking hands. She told me, Ruby said in a low voice, that if anything ever happened to her, I should look behind the dressing table drawer, but when I did, there was nothing there. Ah, Miss Marple said, accepting her tea. Then perhaps someone else knew to look there first. She was afraid of something, not just afraid, ashamed too, and angry. She didn't cry like most people do when they're sad. She laughed, this awful little laugh like she knew something terrible but couldn't say it. She'd stop in the middle of brushing her hair and just stare at herself like she didn't recognize the face. Miss Marple stirred her tea once, twice. Did she ever mention her family? Her sister? Ruby hesitated. Only once. She said that blood could turn against you faster than strangers could. I thought it strange at the time, but now... She never told you what she meant. No, ma'am, but she did start receiving letters just before the tea. She burned most of them. Most? One she kept in her handbag. I only saw it once when I was helping her find her powder. It was written in blue ink, very neat hand, signed only with an initial. She folded it back in like it was precious, but the next day, it was gone. Before or after the charity tea? Ruby thought for a moment. After. That same night, I found the handbag overturned. She told me not to worry about it. Miss Marple's eyes rested gently on the girl's face. You did very well to remember. After she left, she walked along the narrow path that curved behind the churchyard, avoiding the village square where Inspector Cray was speaking to Mr. Eddington, the newspaper man, who had begun his own informal investigation in the form of a special supplement for the next issue. Gossip had grown more cautious, though, especially after the inspector's visit to the library was followed by the arrival of a man from London, no uniform, but sharp-eyed and distant. Scotland Yard, perhaps, or someone sent privately. Either way, it confirmed Miss Marple's instinct. Someone was taking this very seriously, and not for the reasons being whispered over fences. That afternoon, Miss Marple received an envelope hand-delivered by young Peter Croft, the errand boy, who also took care of the flower beds at Weatherly. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. On it were 5 words in a cramped, hasty scrawl. He knows she told someone. No signature. No other markings. The paper smelled faintly of rosemary and coal dust. Miss Marple placed it beside the lavender oil in Delphine's empty envelope. She now had the outline of something. Delphine had been preparing to speak, to write, perhaps to confess. But someone had known even before the tea that she might. The green dress had not been merely dramatic. It had been a signal, just as she'd warned Mrs. Halliday. Someone saw it and moved fast. What concerned Miss Marple now was not merely who had killed Delphine, but the tone of the note. He knows she told someone. It meant the killer wasn't yet sure whom Delphine had spoken to, and that meant someone else might be in danger. She returned to her desk, took out a small notebook with pressed violets on the cover, and wrote 3 names: Geoffrey Hardcastle, Ruby Clark, and Reverend Halliday. Then she drew a question mark beside each. Then, beneath them, a 4th name, one that had appeared only in whisper and implication until now. Imogen Vale. Delphine's sister, estranged. Mentioned only once, but enough. Winchester, Delphine had said once in passing. A curious place to exile a sibling to, unless it hadn't been exile at all. Miss Marple folded her notes and placed them carefully away. As the rain eased to a fine mist, she reached for her coat and parasol and walked quietly toward the church. Inside, the Reverend was alone, adjusting the hymn board. He turned, surprised to see her. "Miss Marple," he said, "is everything quite all right?" "Oh, I believe it is," she said pleasantly. "I was just wondering if I might ask you something quite trivial, but rather urgent." "Certainly." Miss Marple's voice lowered. "Do you recall a woman named Imogen Vale ever writing to your wife? Or perhaps asking after her sister through the parish?" The Reverend blinked. "Imogen Vale? Yes. My wife mentioned the name once. A letter, yes, weeks ago. Something about reconciliation. But Delphine told her never to respond." "Did your wife keep the letter?" He hesitated. "I believe she did. Would you be so good as to retrieve it for me? Quietly." He studied her face for a moment, saw the seriousness in her eyes, and nodded. As he stepped into the adjoining room, Miss Marple turned slightly, her eyes resting on the stained glass window above the altar. It depicted St. Beryl herself, gentle-eyed, serene, and bearing a book clasped tight to her chest. Miss Marple smiled faintly. A confession was indeed coming, and now someone else might need to wear green. The letter arrived in a small envelope, cream-colored and unadorned, bearing only the name Mrs. Halliday in soft blue ink. Reverend Halliday placed it delicately into Miss Marple's hands, as though passing over something alive and fragile. They stood in the vestry, the morning sun catching on the polished brass of the candlesticks behind them, the rest of the church empty and hushed. "My wife never replied," he said quietly. "Delphine insisted it would only make things worse." Miss Marple opened the envelope carefully, sliding the letter out with fingertips used to handling frail things. The paper was thick and old-fashioned, and the handwriting elegant, though slightly tilted, as if the writer were attempting steadiness and only half succeeding. "Dearest Delphine, I do not write to reopen wounds, only to tell you that I remember everything, and I no longer believe the silence helps anyone. If you are still afraid, I can speak first. You needn't carry it alone. There are things I will confess, yes, but also things you must. Say when. A color, if you like. You always did prefer signals to plain words. Yours, still Imogen." There was no date, no address, just the faded postmark of Winchester and the trace of pressed lilac somewhere within the paper. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly, absorbing each word again in silence. She returned it to the envelope and thanked the Reverend, who looked increasingly unsettled. "I didn't read it until this morning," he said, almost apologetically. "Jane tucked it away and forgot it, I think. Or perhaps she didn't forget. Perhaps she meant for you to see it in the end." Miss Marple gave him a thoughtful look. "Sometimes, the kindest people see secrets as a sort of private burden, but burdens grow heavier when carried alone." As she walked back to her cottage, her thoughts rearranged themselves with quiet efficiency. So Imogen knew. Imogen had offered to speak first, and Delphine had answered, in green. Whatever bound them wasn't just a family quarrel, but something heavier, something that involved guilt and fear in equal measure. Miss Marple no longer doubted that Delphine had intended to confess. Perhaps not to the village, but certainly to someone. Perhaps even to the police. But she had waited too long. And someone else had not. That evening, the village met again. This time at the community hall for a makeshift vigil organized hastily by Mrs. Ellison and the vicar's wife, both of whom wore restrained expressions of grief and modestly dark coats. The attendance was respectful, though strained. People spoke in murmurs. Delphine had never been truly loved by the village, not in the way long-standing residents are embraced. She had been too much, too beautiful, too stylish, too distant. But now that she was gone, she was elevated to a kind of polite tragedy. Colonel Hardcastle was present but silent, standing near the entrance with shoulders squared and face blank. His hands remained behind his back, fingers twitching every few minutes. Ruby Clark sat 3 rows in, eyes red but dry, seated beside her mother. The vicar gave a brief and somewhat meandering prayer, and then, awkwardly, people began to file out into the cooling dusk. Miss Marple stayed behind. She had spotted something. As people rose from their chairs, she noticed a woman in a dark gray coat slipping quietly out the side exit. Not someone she recognized immediately. Her gait was careful, too deliberate, and her face half hidden beneath a modest hat. But there was something familiar in the way she held her handbag. Close, protectively, like someone used to having things taken from her. Miss Marple moved without fuss, weaving gently through the dispersing crowd and out into the narrow alley beside the hall. The woman was already at the end of it, hesitating slightly as if unsure which direction to take. "Miss Vale," Miss Marple called gently. The woman froze. After a moment, she turned slowly, lowering the brim of her hat just enough to reveal her face. She was not as striking as Delphine had been, her features plainer, her skin pale and uneven, but there was a dignity in the way she straightened her shoulders, as if bracing against a blow she expected but no longer feared. "I wondered if you would come," Miss Marple said, approaching with measured steps. "You were very brave to write." Imogen looked at her warily. She never replied. "No," Miss Marple said, "but she did wear green." Something in Imogen's face flickered. So she got the letter. Yes, and someone else understood the signal. Imogen took a shaky breath. "I shouldn't have come. I thought perhaps it was too late. But then I read the news. The papers said it was her heart. That's not true, is it?" Miss Marple hesitated. "We don't know. But I believe she was silenced before she could speak." Imogen looked down at her hands, tightly knotted in front of her. "She told me, once, that if anything ever happened, I should come in person, but we hadn't spoken properly in nearly 4 years. I only wrote now because I found something Father had hidden." Miss Marple remained still, letting the pause stretch. "What was it?" "A letter. From Delphine. Dated the week after the fire." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but a flicker of recognition moved through her eyes. "The fire in Cheltenham," Imogen nodded. "The one they always called an accident. Only it wasn't. And she knew that. She caused it," Imogen said quietly. Or at least she thought she had. She was 16. She said she'd meant to frighten him, not hurt him. But he died. She told me in the letter, I only wanted him to be afraid for once. She never forgave herself. Miss Marple's hands folded lightly over each other. "And did anyone else know?" "Our mother, perhaps. But she died 2 years later. I don't think Geoffrey ever knew the full truth. He and Delphine married after the inquest was closed. I think he believed she'd been cleared. But she wasn't cleared. Not truly. Just overlooked." Imogen looked away, down the road where the last of the villagers were dispersing into shadows and porch lights. "I think someone else found out. Someone who saw the signal and knew it meant the end of a secret. And feared what it might uncover," Miss Marple said gently. Imogen turned back to her. "I'll speak to the police. If it helps." "It might," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, "but only if the right ears are listening. I think, Miss Vale, you may be in danger still." Imogen blinked. "Why?" "Because whoever silenced Delphine," Miss Marple said softly, "doesn't yet know how much she told you, and now they may wonder whether they need to stop you next." Imogen paled. Miss Marple took her arm gently, like an old friend. "Come. I think it's time we both had a word with Inspector Cray. But not tonight. Tonight, you'll stay with me. No one need know you've arrived. Not yet." And together, they turned into the misted lane, two quiet shadows slipping past the hedge, carrying with them a thread of truth just beginning to unravel. The air was cool and still as Miss Marple drew the curtains of her guest bedroom and returned to the small fireplace where Imogen sat curled in a worn armchair, a woolen shawl over her shoulders. The faint glow from the hearth lent the room a gentle warmth, though it did little to ease the tension that gripped her guest's thin frame. Imogen had barely touched the cup of cocoa Miss Marple had offered, and her fingers now clutched the porcelain as if it might steady the unraveling world around her. Miss Marple sat nearby with her mending, though the needle paused more than it moved. She watched Imogen with the same soft intensity she brought to the vicar's sermon or the grocer's gossip. Quiet, unjudging, precise. "She was always braver than me," Imogen murmured finally, not lifting her eyes. "Even when we were little, she could lie without blinking if it meant protecting someone, or hurting them. Sometimes I wasn't sure which." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied gently. She learned that bravery and fear aren't opposites. Sometimes they travel hand in hand. Imogen looked over. "Do you believe she meant to confess?" "Yes," Miss Marple said without hesitation. "Though not, I think, in the way people imagine. It would not have been dramatic. No letters to the police, but she had decided to stop hiding. And that can be just as dangerous." Imogen's lips parted slightly, as if she would say more, but instead she lowered her eyes to the fire. The next morning came grey and expectant, with low clouds pressing gently against the roofs of St. Beryl's as if trying to hush its secrets. Miss Marple rose early and prepared breakfast for two, then left Imogen resting in the quiet of the sitting room while she walked into the village with an envelope tucked inside her sleeve. She made no attempt to disguise her purpose. Anyone who saw her would think she was paying one of her many polite visits, and they would not be wrong. At the police cottage, Inspector Cray stood at the window with a mug of tea in one hand and a frown on his face. He looked up as Miss Marple was announced by the constable and gestured her in with the weary air of a man ready for complication. "You've something, Miss Marple?" he asked, already anticipating it. "Yes," she said, taking a seat opposite him. "Though I should say first that I'm not here with speculation. I'm here with a letter and a name." That made him sit up straighter. She handed the envelope across. He opened it, read the short note inside, and then sat back. "Imogen Vale. Sister. Alive?" "Very much so. She arrived yesterday evening. She's frightened, Inspector, and for good reason." Cray's brow furrowed. "The fire?" "Yes, and what it was meant to conceal." He let out a low breath. "This was never just a village affair, was it?" "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "It was a buried story from somewhere else that came looking for closure and found something else." He glanced at the letter again. "She's willing to speak?" "She is, but not in public and not here. I suggest you come to the cottage later this afternoon. Quietly. No uniform." Cray nodded slowly. "Very well." Miss Marple stood but paused before turning. "There's something else. A visitor from London seen, speaking with Mr. Eddington and again near Weatherly House. I suspect not police." Cray's expression darkened. "I'll look into that." As she returned to the cottage, Miss Marple stopped briefly at the corner near the post office, where Mrs. Ellison was rearranging a stack of letters on her way to tea with Mrs. Simpkins. The older woman smiled, tight-lipped. "So dreadful, Jane," she said without prompting. "And still no answers." "They always come," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Usually from the quietest places." Mrs. Ellison sniffed. "I suppose the Colonel's taken to his study again. Rarely seen these days." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Grief makes people retreat," or guilt. Hard to tell which at first. The remark hung just long enough to stir something behind Mrs. Ellison's eyes before Miss Marple turned and went on her way. Back at the cottage, she found Imogen in the garden, seated on the old wooden bench beneath the mulberry tree. The birds were unusually quiet, and the breeze barely stirred the leaves, as if even nature were holding its breath. "He'll come this afternoon," Miss Marple said gently. Imogen nodded, but did not speak. "Did she ever tell you about her husband?" Miss Marple asked after a moment. "Not much," Imogen said. "She said he was kind at first, but distant. I don't think he ever really knew her. She didn't let him. She told me once that love meant too many eyes on you, and she'd rather be alone than exposed." Miss Marple sat beside her, and yet she tried in the end to open something. "Yes," Imogen whispered, "and she paid for it." Later that day, Inspector Cray arrived in plain clothes and was admitted through the back. They spoke in the sitting room with the curtains half drawn and a single lamp lit. Imogen's voice was steadier than expected. She told him everything, about the fire, the letter Delphine had sent, the guilt, the fear, the plan to confess. Cray listened without interruption, taking notes only occasionally, his jaw tight. When she finished, he sat back and closed his notebook. "Do you believe someone in the village knew all of this?" he asked. "I don't know," Imogen said honestly. "But someone knew enough to kill her." Miss Marple's voice was soft but clear. "There's one thing you should know, Inspector. The letter Delphine wrote after the fire, it was never found. Imogen only saw a copy she'd made for herself. But the original, that was meant for someone else. She left it hidden in her dressing room, in a compartment behind the drawer. Ruby Clark looked for it, but it was gone." Cray leaned forward. "So someone found it before the maid could?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "which means the killer didn't act out of panic. They had time to prepare. They were watching, and they knew that letter would be the end of them." Cray's eyes narrowed. "You think it's someone close? Someone trusted?" Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "Someone who knew how to listen without seeming to, who knew her habits, someone who'd already learned what she was trying to hide." Cray's voice was low. "The Colonel?" But Miss Marple did not answer. Instead, she rose and went to the mantel, where a small frame sat, one holding a photo of a long-past garden party in which Delphine stood beside Ruby, and just behind her, barely visible, stood another face. A face with eyes too alert, too fixed. Not the Colonel. Cray stood slowly, following her gaze. "I'll need to speak with him," he said. "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "Not yet. You'll frighten him, and he'll shut the door. Let me speak with him first." Cray hesitated, then nodded. Miss Marple turned back toward the window, where dusk was settling into the hedges, and the lamplight caught the gleam of the mulberry leaves. Somewhere beyond the stillness, she could feel the story tightening, not toward chaos, but clarity, because the person they were looking for hadn't run. He was still watching. The knock at the back door came just as the sky began its descent into a sallow, purplish gray. Miss Marple answered it herself, ushering in a draught of cool evening air, and behind it, Peter Croft, the errand boy and part-time gardener, cap clutched between his hands and an anxious flush on his cheeks. He glanced about the room with the furtive alertness of someone used to going unseen. "I'm sorry for the hour, miss," he said, voice hushed and uneven. "But I've something I think I ought to say." She guided him gently to the armchair by the hearth and poured him a cup of warm tea without fuss. He held it in both hands, but didn't drink. "It's about the Colonel," he said quietly, "and about the day before the lady died." Miss Marple said nothing, only folded her hands in her lap and inclined her head for him to go on. "I was helping with the back hedges," Peter said. "He didn't see me. I was down low behind the trellis. I heard his voice coming from the study window, low, angry. but not like he'd lost his temper, more like he'd already made up his mind. "Was he alone?" Miss Marple asked softly. "No, miss. There was someone with him. Didn't see who, but the voice, it sounded younger. Nervous. A man." Peter glanced up, eyes darting. "They were talking about the letter. I heard the colonel say, if she goes ahead with it, it all falls apart. For you, not for me. You'll be the one seen as the coward, the manipulator." And then he said, "Get it before she changes her mind, or you'll wish you had." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a fine line. "Are you certain of the words?" "Yes, miss. I ran them over and over in my head. I couldn't stop thinking about it after it happened." "You've done very well to come forward," she said gently. "Would you be brave enough to repeat that for Inspector Cray when the time comes?" Peter nodded, though his hands trembled slightly around the cup. "Good. Then go home now, and say nothing to anyone." After the boy left, Miss Marple stood for a long time at the edge of her sitting room, looking not at the fire, but at the framed photograph on the mantel. In it, Delphine smiled, a shallow, posed smile, and just over her shoulder stood a figure who had only now begun to come into sharper focus. She stepped across the room and opened a drawer in the escritoire, retrieving the small notebook in which she'd been assembling her quiet web. She turned to the page with 4 names and wrote in a 5th. Benedict Eddington, the village's newspaper editor, bookish and precise, with an unusual reach for someone who rarely left his desk. A man who had a reason to be at every event, whose profession gave him license to ask questions, to gather scraps of paper, to collect stories. A man whom no one ever suspected of involvement because he never seemed emotionally involved. Observers often go unobserved. But Peter's words had struck a chord, not just the mention of a younger man, but the phrase coward and manipulator. Words that spoke of a tangled past, perhaps of guilt or resentment that Delphine had chosen to speak when he perhaps had not. Miss Marple remembered with sudden clarity the brief glance she had exchanged with Eddington at the vigil. He'd been standing at the edge of the room near the exit, not quite mourning, not quite watching, almost as though he were waiting. And then there was the London visitor. If Eddington had discovered Delphine's secret, perhaps even before she planned to reveal it, he might have feared exposure himself. Perhaps he had helped to bury something in the past, or perhaps he simply knew too much and wanted to ensure silence stayed sealed. It was time, she thought, to pay him a visit. The newspaper office sat at the corner of the village square, beside the apothecary and 2 doors down from the milliner's. Its bell tinkled lightly as Miss Marple entered, brushing a few raindrops from her coat. Inside, the walls were lined with filing cabinets and back issues. Mr. Eddington sat at a desk near the window, sorting a stack of proofs with a fountain pen in hand. He looked up with polite surprise. "Miss Marple, a pleasure. I hope you're not bringing a letter to the editor. There's quite a queue this week." She smiled. "No, I'm afraid I bring only curiosity. You see, I've been thinking about Delphine Hardcastle, and about how quickly the paper was ready to print the moment she died." Eddington tilted his head slightly, a flicker of tension in the set of his mouth. "It was a public death. The village expects detail. We serve the facts." "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, "if the facts were something you already knew, something you suspected, perhaps, from before the tea." Eddington set his pen down slowly. "That's quite a suggestion. You visited London recently," she continued. "Or at least someone came down from London to see you. You were seen at the train station and again near Weatherly House. Perhaps someone connected to the past you and Delphine shared." His eyes narrowed, but he did not speak. "She wore green to signal a confession," Miss Marple said. "Not to the police, not to her husband. She was going to name someone who had once convinced her to remain silent about what happened in Cheltenham. And then, years later, when she changed her mind, When Imogen wrote to her and offered to speak first, you stepped in. Eddington rose slowly from the desk. You don't know anything. I know you feared what she might reveal, Miss Marple said, voice soft. Because you were there, weren't you? At the house, perhaps not in the fire itself, but close enough. Maybe you helped conceal something. Maybe you told her to hide. Maybe she listened. Until now. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked to the far cabinet. His back was to her, but his voice remained steady. She said she forgave me, you know, in the letter. Not for what I did, but for not doing more. I never hurt her, but I never stopped it either. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. And that is its own wound. Eddington didn't respond. Outside, the rain had begun in earnest, and Miss Marple knew there would be no outright confession. Not here. But there would be enough. Enough for Cray. Enough to open the door to charges of obstruction, at the very least, and perhaps worse, if the path led deeper. She turned to leave, then paused. One last thing, she said gently. Where did you hide the letter? Eddington gave a dry, sad smile without turning around. In the hollow of the globe in the study. She always liked secrets that turned on their axis. Miss Marple nodded once and slipped out into the rain, the bell chiming softly behind her. The street glistened with reflected light, and the cottage windows glowed faintly under their thatched brows. She walked home in the dark, her mind knitting each thread into place. It was nearly time to bring the pieces together, but one thread still wavered, the Colonel. Not as the killer, perhaps, but as someone who had known the truth far longer than anyone guessed. And that silence, too, would have its consequence. The following morning, the village woke beneath a ceiling of slate-gray sky. Clouds hung low and close, pressing their weight down upon the chimneys and hedgerows of St. Beryl's, as though in anticipation of something long overdue. Inside her neat front parlor, Miss Marple poured a fresh cup of tea and set it beside a folded piece of paper on the table. The handwriting was hers, firm, precise, written after returning home from her visit to Mr. Eddington. She had not slept much. There were knots still to untangle. The facts were no longer scattered, but sat in tense proximity, like chess pieces arranged just before a final move. And the one she needed to speak with now was not a suspect, but a man who had chosen to look away for far too long. Colonel Geoffrey Hardcastle had made himself largely inaccessible since Delphine's death. He had answered Inspector Cray's questions with perfunctory formality, had offered no public comment, and had withdrawn behind the curtains of Weatherly House as if the very air outside might accuse him. But Miss Marple had always known that silence, when persistent, often disguised not ignorance but an unbearable form of knowing. Shortly after 11, she walked the quiet lane to Weatherly and rapped lightly at the side door. It was Ruby Clark who answered, eyes watchful, but not surprised. He's in the library, ma'am. Been there since morning, Ruby said in a low voice. Didn't touch his breakfast. Just the paper and his pipe, same as always. Only he hasn't lit the pipe. Miss Marple gave her a kind smile and stepped through the dim corridor, the air heavy with furniture polish and something more difficult to name. The door to the library stood ajar. Inside, the Colonel sat beside the window in a high-backed chair, his posture rigid but not alert. He looked older than she remembered, as though something internal had begun to collapse in on itself. He did not turn as she entered. "I hoped you might call," he said flatly. Eventually. She moved to the chair opposite and sat without speaking. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the distant ticking of a brass clock on the mantel. "I don't know what you've uncovered," he said, finally turning to meet her eyes. "I imagine quite a lot." "I've spoken with your sister-in-law," Miss Marple said gently. "She arrived 2 evenings ago. She shared a letter from Delphine, one that pointed clearly to what happened in Cheltenham, and I believe you knew." The Colonel's gaze drifted away. Not at first. Not when we married. I thought she was haunted by something. I'd seen that kind of tremor in men after battle. But she never told me the whole of it. Not until last year. What changed? Miss Marple asked. She started speaking to Imogen again, tentatively, cautiously. I suppose it brought the old wound closer to the surface. One night, last December, I think, she woke me in the middle of the night. Just stood there, silent. Then she said, "It wasn't the fire, Jeff. It was what I didn't do afterwards." And she sat down and wept. Not the kind of weeping you comfort, the kind you endure. And after that, she told me everything about the man, about her fear, and about how Eddington had known or guessed and convinced her to say nothing. She said she carried the guilt like a coin sewn under her skin. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "You didn't encourage her to go to the police." I told her it was in the past, that the law wouldn't bring anything back, that she should forgive herself and move on. His voice cracked slightly. I thought I was protecting her. But she didn't want protection. She wanted absolution. He nodded slowly. Yes, and I denied her that. I told her she would bring shame to herself. I said it was weakness, that she should be stronger. Miss Marple watched him carefully. And when she made the decision to confess, I tried to stop her, he admitted. Not because I feared the truth, but because I feared what it would do to her. What people would say, what they'd see when they looked at her, or what they'd see when they looked at you. He flinched, but didn't deny it. "She wore green," Miss Marple said. "She gave her signal, and the moment she did, someone else knew they had to act. Eddington, most likely. Perhaps he feared the story would loop back to him. Perhaps he had his own role in that fire. But he moved quickly. He retrieved the letter from your study, hid it in the globe. And shortly after that, she died." The Colonel closed his eyes. "I didn't kill her, Miss Marple, but I might as well have. I left her alone in that room when she needed me most." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "You left her alone many years ago, when she told you she was carrying something too heavy, and you chose not to share it." He was silent a long time. Then, at last, he said, "What happens now?" "I've spoken to Inspector Cray," she replied. "Imogen will testify. Eddington will be questioned. He may not have delivered the final act, but he orchestrated the silencing. If there was another hand involved, we shall know it soon." "And me?" "That depends on what you choose to do next." He nodded slowly. "I still have her letter, the one she left for me. I couldn't bring myself to read it." Miss Marple reached into her bag and withdrew a folded sheet. "She made a copy," she said softly. "She kept it in her handbag. I believe she wanted someone to find it, even if she didn't live long enough to give it away herself." She placed the letter on the small table beside him and stood. As she stepped back into the hallway, Ruby emerged from the shadows like someone waiting for a verdict. "He didn't mean for it to happen," Ruby whispered. "No," Miss Marple said, "but it happened because of what he couldn't bear to face." Outside, the air had changed. The clouds had begun to split, narrow bands of light breaking through in pale gold. The kind of light that comes not with joy, but with clarity. Back at the cottage, Imogen sat at the table with a small pile of letters in front of her, her eyes red but dry. "Did he know?" she asked, looking up. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "He knew. And he's grieving now. Not just the woman he lost, but the silence he kept." Imogen nodded slowly, her fingers curling around one of the unopened envelopes. She used to say the hardest part of being forgiven is admitting that you need to be. Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. "Your sister was very wise." She poured the tea then, and they sat together as the village outside moved cautiously back to its routines. Children walking home from school, the postmen wheeling past, the bakery shuttering for the day. A kind of stillness had returned, but it wasn't peace. Not yet. It was the hush that comes before the truth steps fully into the room, and tomorrow, Miss Marple thought, the final door would open. The next morning dawned with a stillness that felt poised, as though the village itself held its breath in quiet expectation. The first post arrived just before 8. A small stack of envelopes slipped through Miss Marple's door with the faintest rustle. She glanced at them without interest until one stood out. A pale blue envelope, sealed with a precise line of glue and no return address, addressed in a hand she recognized instantly. Benedict Eddington's. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear the paper. Inside was a single sheet, its contents brief. Miss Marple, I imagine the shape of things is already clear to you. What you don't know, what perhaps no one does, is that she came to me once, long ago, when the fire was still only ashes and the coroner's report barely dry. She said she wanted to confess. I told her not to. She asked me if that made me a bad man. I said no. I believed it then. I'm not sure I do now. They'll come for me soon. I won't run. Before the events, Miss Marple read the letter twice, then folded it and set it on the small table beside the kettle. She did not smile. She did not sigh. Instead, she turned to the window and watched as the shape of St. Beryl's sharpened in the golden morning. Cray would be calling soon, and it would fall to her, once again, to place each piece of truth in the right order, not for justice, not for vengeance, but for understanding. The motive, she had always known, was never just the crime. It was the soul beneath it. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Cray arrived. He had not come in a car this time, but on foot, coat folded over his arm and a weariness in his step that matched the gravity in his eyes. She ushered him in with no fanfare, and he sat at the table, his notebook unopened. Eddington gave himself up an hour ago, he said. He said nothing at first, just handed me a copy of the same letter you've got. We've taken him in, but I don't yet know what charges will stick. There's no hard evidence placing him in the dressing room, no prints, no poison. Miss Marple nodded, pouring tea for them both. But he knew what he'd done. He knew it would be enough. Cray studied her for a moment. What do you believe happened, Miss Marple? She settled into her chair and spoke in her quiet, deliberate voice, the one that left no room for contradiction, yet never demanded obedience. Delphine had been ready to break her silence for some time. Her sister's letter merely opened the door. She had confided in her husband months earlier, and though he discouraged her from acting, she had begun to make preparations. The green dress was her signal. She wore it not only for Mrs. Halliday, but for Eddington. She wanted him to know she was no longer afraid. Cray leaned forward. But why Eddington? Why give him any warning? Because, Miss Marple said, she hoped he might do the right thing. She always believed people were capable of better. Even him. The inspector exhaled slowly. So he went to her. Yes, the night of the charity tea. He came under the pretense of returning a mislaid paper or perhaps something she left behind at the village hall. Ruby Clark was busy elsewhere and the house was quiet. He confronted her. He tried to persuade her, again, to stay silent. But she was firm this time. And he panicked. You think he killed her in that moment? No, Miss Marple said. I think he threatened her, and I think she asked him to leave. I believe the actual death occurred shortly after, when Delphine drank her usual evening cordial, prepared, no doubt, as part of her routine. I think Eddington slipped something into it while she was distracted. But there's no sign of poison. None detectable, Miss Marple agreed. But some herbs act quickly and leave almost nothing. Foxglove, for instance, or aconitum in small doses. Both grow wild nearby. He would have known that. And she would not have expected him to know how to use them. Cray rubbed his temple. So you believe he killed her, not out of hatred, but to keep her quiet? Yes. but not just about Cheltenham, about himself. Delphine had begun to see him for what he was, a man who had built his self-worth on being silent in the right places. He had watched something terrible happen in their youth. Perhaps he had even helped orchestrate the cover-up. But worse than that, he had told her to carry it alone. The inspector was silent for a moment. Then he said, "He won't admit to the poisoning." "No," Miss Marple replied. "But he doesn't have to. His silence is a form of confession, and I believe he intends to live with the weight of it." "And the Colonel?" Miss Marple took a sip of her tea. "He will never be prosecuted for anything. But he'll serve his time, Inspector, quietly, in the library of his own conscience." He let her shoulder the storm when he could have stepped forward, and now it's too late. Cray sat back, arms crossed. "You always get there, don't you?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Not always in time." He rose, gathering his coat. "You'll let the sister know?" "Yes, gently." After he left, Miss Marple sat a long while, watching the way the sunlight flickered across the edge of the tablecloth. Then she stood and walked to the sitting room, where Imogen sat with a sketchpad in her lap and a pencil idle between her fingers. "Eddington has turned himself in," Miss Marple said. "There will likely be no trial, but the truth will be acknowledged." Imogen closed her eyes briefly. "Thank you for telling me." "She wore green," Miss Marple said, almost to herself, to signal that she was no longer afraid. "She always did like green," Imogen murmured. "It made her feel brave." Miss Marple reached for a folded scarf on the back of the chair, the same one they'd found beneath the hedge after the tea, its green silk still stained faintly by soil. She held it out, and Imogen took it without hesitation. Later that day, Miss Marple walked once more past Weatherly House. The garden was overgrown at the edges now, the grass curling in the corners, but the lilacs had begun to bloom despite themselves, and on the path leading to the main door, a new thing had appeared, a single pale bench facing the trees. A quiet place, perhaps, for memory. She paused there a moment, letting the breeze settle around her. No one else in the village would ever know the full story. They would remember Delphine for her beauty or her aloofness, for the charity tea and the green dress, for the scandal that had brushed past but never fully broken through. But Miss Marple would remember something else, the way people tried to silence shame by silencing each other, and how sometimes it only takes one quiet signal to undo it all. She turned and walked back toward the village square, her steps slow but steady. There were lilacs to be cut, letters to be written, and always, always, the quiet watching of human nature as it unfolded, tangled, imperfect, and, at times, just brave enough. 2 days passed with an unnatural quiet over St. Beryl's, the kind that followed not just death, but exposure. The villagers, once eager with speculation, had turned inward. Conversations clipped at doorsteps, glances exchanged with wariness, and a general hush descending over their customary rhythms. The truth, or some shape of it, had settled uneasily in the soil of the village, and while no trial loomed and no front-page scandal would spell out the details, people knew, or suspected. And in places like St. Beryl's, suspicion was as good as certainty. Miss Marple, for her part, did not push. She moved about her days with her usual routines, sweeping the porch, visiting the greengrocer, trimming the roses back just enough to keep them neat. But beneath it all, she was still listening. Listening not just to what was said, but to what had stopped being said. There were no more whispers about the Colonel's stiffness or Delphine's temper. No more sideways remarks about Imogen's resemblance to her sister. It was as though the village had reached its limit of what it could admit out loud. But Miss Marple knew the story wasn't finished. On the third morning, a note arrived, tucked into the fold of the Beryl Bulletin. It was unsigned, written in blockish masculine script, and read simply, "She wasn't the only one," he warned. "Check the ledger behind the curtain." There was no name, no instruction. But Miss Marple didn't need more. She had suspected, after her conversation with the Colonel, that someone else had been part of the quiet circling around Delphine in those last days. Someone who had seen the dress, perhaps even overheard the conversation with Eddington, and decided it was better not to be drawn into it. But now, this stranger, perhaps driven by guilt or fear of implication, was nudging open the final door. She made her way to the village hall just before the lunch hour, when it would be empty. Mrs. Ellison's knitting group had met that morning, but they had cleared out promptly at 11, and the chairs were still stacked neatly along the back wall. At the front of the room stood the old oak ledger cabinet, an unassuming piece tucked behind the thick maroon curtain that was drawn only for dramatic productions or amateur recitals. She slipped behind the curtain soundlessly. The cabinet was locked, but not securely. She found the latch yielded easily to the blade of her umbrella tip. Inside were the ledgers, years' worth of village minutes, notes from flower shows and planning meetings. She scanned the spines until she found the one marked for the present year. It was heavier than the others, and when she opened it, a folded piece of paper slid out from between the pages marked March, Charity, Afternoon, Tea. She opened it. It was a list. Names, dates, short cryptic notations beside each. D. Hardcastle, Green, T-signal, contacted by B.E.R. Clark. Overheard something? Uncertain loyalty. Watched. I Vale. Possible arrival. Letter intercepted but may resend. Halliday, too gentle, safe. Ellison, useful distraction. Peacroft, saw too much. Avoid direct approach. Miss Marple's eyes did not widen, but a muscle in her jaw twitched. This was not Eddington's hand, nor was it the Colonel's. The writing was different, angled, impatient, uncertain in its pressure. Someone who observed closely, but without understanding subtlety. Someone attempting control, but from the shadows. And then, at the bottom of the page, scribbled almost as an afterthought, Plan B, Globe letter retrieved. No need for further warning unless Vale appears. She folded the note and tucked it into her sleeve. There was someone else. Eddington might have been the one who stepped too far, who administered the fatal act, but someone else had known. Had helped, had drawn the circle wider, perhaps out of fear or power, or something smaller and harder to define. And this person was still free. Back at her cottage, she laid the note flat beside the other documents. She cross-checked the handwriting against samples she kept, old thank-you cards, notices from the post office, even a signed program from the last village play. It didn't match Eddington, or the Colonel, or the vicar. But one match began to form, not exact but close enough. Slanted letters, hard, angular pressure. The P and R most telling of all. She pulled from her drawer a Christmas card, dated from the previous year, signed, "From all of us at the Beryl Bulletin, Peter Croft, assistant layout and errand." Peter, the boy who'd come to her with fear in his eyes. The one who delivered the letter. The one she thought had stumbled into danger. But what if he had done more than stumble? Miss Marple sat still for a very long time, her hands folded lightly in her lap. The boy was clever, yes, observant, overlooked, just the sort Eddington might have seen as useful. She recalled Peter's flushed cheeks, his anxious glances. He had told her the Colonel had spoken to someone younger in hushed tones, and perhaps that was true. But perhaps Peter had never overheard that conversation. Perhaps he had been in it. She left the cottage just before tea, slipping through the lanes toward the back entrance of the newspaper office. It was quiet, the shutters half down. The printing press silent for the first time in days. She rapped gently on the side door. It was Peter who opened it. His eyes widened. "Miss Marple, you all right? I wonder if I might borrow a moment of your time," she said kindly. "It's about the list." He froze. I don't know what you mean." Her voice remained soft. "The one behind the curtain. The one with your handwriting." He stepped back, shaking his head. "Number no, Mr. Eddington asked me to keep an eye out, that's all. He said some people might cause trouble at the tea. Said I should report anything strange." "And you wrote it down?" she asked. He hesitated. "Just notes, not real things. Just in case." "Did you see him put something in her drink?" "Number no. I wasn't even..." He stopped himself, too late. "You were in the house," she said gently. "You weren't just watching. You were inside. Maybe just for a moment. Maybe you thought it didn't matter. Maybe you thought you were helping." Peter's eyes filled, his mouth trembling. "I didn't know he'd actually do it," he whispered. "I thought he just wanted to scare her, just enough to stop her. He said she'd ruin everything, that she was unstable, that I'd be helping the village, helping him." Miss Marple stepped forward and took his hand, the way one might steady a child standing at the edge of a steep hill. "You must tell the inspector," she said. "Today, all of it. The truth isn't just about guilt. It's about release. Yours too." Peter nodded, small and shivering, and Miss Marple walked him down the lane, her arm around his shoulder, just as the clouds parted above them and the first clear shaft of late spring light broke through, casting the cobbles in soft gold. The final shadow, at last, had stepped into the light. The days that followed settled into an unspoken stillness, like dust floating after a long movement through the air. St. Beryl's did not erupt in scandal or vindication. It never did. Instead, it absorbed revelation as it did the seasons, letting it settle softly into the corners of its post office queues and garden gate greetings. There were no headlines beyond the barest official notice tucked near the bottom of the parish bulletin. A full investigation into the events surrounding the late Mrs. Delphine Hardcastle has concluded. No further comment. But beneath that statement lay truths that had rippled through the village's quiet heart. Truths that would not be forgotten. Peter Croft had made his statement in full. He had walked, pale and shaking, into Inspector Cray's office the same afternoon Miss Marple brought him down the lane. The confession had been halting but thorough. How Eddington had approached him months earlier with vague instructions to observe Miss Hardcastle. How he'd been told to take notes, to watch for signs of instability. Eddington had used words that seemed gentle but were not. Protective, necessary, preventative. He had preyed on Peter's desire to be useful, to be taken seriously. And then, on the afternoon of the charity tea, Eddington had told Peter to deliver a letter under the guise of an errand. It wasn't the first, but this one, Peter now knew, contained the final threat. Peter had lingered at the house, hoping to retrieve it again, to undo something, he hadn't known what. He never made it inside the dressing room. But he had seen Eddington walk out through the back garden 10 minutes later, his hands shaking and a smear of something dark, ink or wine, on his sleeve. Eddington had not denied any of it. His quiet surrender, his refusal to request a solicitor, and his final written statement all bore the same tone. Not defiant, not contrite, resigned. He would not fight the consequences, whatever they were. There was talk of obstruction, conspiracy, even manslaughter. But the legal definition seemed smaller than the truth. What had really been killed, Miss Marple thought, was not just a woman's life, but her right to step forward on her own terms. That was the harm. The rest was evidence. Peter would not be charged. Inspector Cray had seen to that, and Miss Marple had agreed. He had been used, but he had also faced his part with a kind of courage many adults would not. He now worked part-time at the parish office under the Reverend's eye, and most of the village, with its instinct for silent forgiveness, had already begun to fold him back into its routines. Imogen Vale had returned to Winchester the day after Peter's confession, with a small suitcase, Delphine's green scarf carefully folded inside, and the letter Miss Marple had given her tucked into her coat. She had kissed Miss Marple's cheek at the train platform and whispered only, "Thank you for letting her speak." And now, in the quiet of the second Sunday since it all began, Miss Marple stood in her garden, trimming back the dead heads of the late tulips. The morning was crisp but pleasant, the air scented with damp earth and something softer, lavender or thyme, maybe. Behind her, a kettle hummed gently, and a blue jay scolded a blackbird from the wire fence with comical indignation. She didn't look up when she heard the gate unlatch. It was Colonel Hardcastle. He stood uncertainly at the edge of the path, hat in hand, his usual sharp posture slightly slackened, as though he no longer felt the need to keep his back straight for anyone's benefit. She turned toward him slowly, and for a long moment they simply regarded each other. "I wasn't sure if I ought to come," he said finally. "You always had the freedom to," she replied. He took a step forward, then another, pausing near the rose trellis. "She was not an easy woman to love," he said, "but she deserved better than what I gave her." Miss Marple bent to snip a yellowing leaf. "We often love people best in memory. It is simpler there." But she didn't want memory. She wanted to be heard. "She told me once that guilt ages differently in women," he said, "that it settles in the hands, in the shoulders. I didn't understand then. And now," he looked at her, weary and worn. "Now I feel it." Miss Marple nodded. "Then you've begun." He stood a while longer, watching the garden, then said softly, "The house is very quiet. It may grow quieter still, but it needn't stay that way forever." He looked at her, unsure whether that was permission or judgment, and perhaps it was both. She offered him a cup of tea, and they sat beneath the apple tree while the wind played gently through the branches. After he left, she returned to the table inside, where a small stack of letters waited to be answered. There was one from her niece in Exeter, another from the woman at the Herb Society asking for a recipe, and a third, a new one, bearing no return address, but stamped in the same blue ink she had seen once before. Inside, only a few lines. "Dear Miss Marple, you were right. There was more to say. Thank you for listening. I think she knew you would." Fie." She folded it carefully and placed it with the others. A light rain had begun tapping against the window, soft and unhurried. Later, walking through the village with her umbrella hooked over her arm, she passed the vicar's wife speaking gently to Ruby Clark outside the post office. Their voices were low, kind. A child ran past them, laughing, and the bell above the grocer's door chimed as someone entered. The village moved on, as it always did, with its slow rhythm and its capacity for forgetting just enough. But Miss Marple did not forget. She remembered the broken glass in the garden, the scarf beneath the hedge, the girl in green who came not to confess guilt, but to reclaim herself. She remembered the silence people used as protection and how easily it turned into complicity. And she remembered, too, how truth rarely shouted. It only waited, quiet and persistent, for someone to look straight at it. She turned down the path toward the churchyard, where the lilacs now bloomed in full. Beside them stood the narrow bench someone had placed quietly, without plaque or fanfare. And on it, today, someone had left a single green ribbon tied loosely around the armrest. Miss Marple sat beside it for a time, listening to the breeze move through the hedges. The story was finished now, but its echo would remain. It was the vicar's summer garden party. A gentle tradition returned at last to its rightful season. The bunting had been strung, the tables laid with lace and sponge cakes, and the scent of late roses drifted over the clipped lawn like a memory allowed to breathe. The villagers of St. Beryl's had turned out in full, dressed in straw hats and linen skirts, greeting one another with the practiced brightness of people who had lived through something together and now wished, quietly, to put it behind them. Miss Marple sat beneath the shade of the elder tree, a glass of lemonade at her side and her knitting balanced in her lap. She was not working it, merely letting the needles rest. Her eyes moved gently over the guests, Mrs. Ellison exclaiming over jam, the vicar's wife laughing too brightly, and Peter Croft handing out napkins at the refreshment table with a calm steadiness that had not been there 2 weeks before. There was, in the air, no mention of Delphine Hardcastle. No one said her name. But in the hush that fell each time someone crossed toward Weatherly House, in the lowered voices when the colonel appeared in his plain grey coat and stood quietly by the hydrangeas, she was present. Inspector Cray arrived just before tea was poured, his coat left behind and his shirt sleeves neatly rolled. He made his way over to Miss Marple and took the seat beside her with the quiet deference of a man who understood that she, not he, had brought the threads together. "Did you hear?" he said under his breath. The magistrate accepted Eddington's statement. No trial. He's to be remanded to a care facility. They say his mind's slipping. Miss Marple gave a slight nod. Perhaps it's only now catching up to him. Cray leaned back, watching the guests. And the boy? Peter is beginning again, she said, and being watched by the right people now. The village will do what it does. Judge, then forget, then pretend to have forgiven. Cray smiled faintly. And the colonel? He has started walking every morning, she said, along the lane behind the chapel. Always alone. I imagine it's the only conversation he can bear. They sat in silence a while. You were right, he said at last. It wasn't about poison or evidence. It was about guilt, and who carried it. Miss Marple looked at him then, a softness in her expression that did not diminish its precision. It's always about guilt, she said, but not always about justice. Sometimes the most important thing is knowing where the story really ends, and who must live with what they did not say. The vicar rang the bell for tea, and the trays began to circulate, and the party lifted once again into light conversation and garden laughter. But as Miss Marple rose and took her plate of scones, she paused beneath the tree and looked once more toward the edge of the lawn. There, beyond the rose hedge, just barely visible through the gap in the foliage, was the old path that led to Weatherly House. And on that path stood Imogen Vale, not approaching, not speaking, just standing, a scarf of pale green tucked beneath her arm, as if she had wandered back not to be seen, but to remember. Miss Marple met her gaze and nodded, just once. Imogen turned and walked away, the scarf slipping slightly loose in the breeze, trailing behind her like a ribbon of something not mourned, but released. And in the hush that followed, the garden party continued. The truth had been spoken. The village had heard, and Miss Marple, as always, had listened longer than most.